The Kremlin has long tried to project an image of limitless strength, endless resources, and infinite patience, and unbreakable supply of manpower. The narrative coming from Moscow rarely changes. Russia can endure anything for as long as necessary. Yet the first financial signals of 2026 tell a very different story. Once the surface of this carefully constructed image is scratched, the reality underneath looks far more troubling. Picture a country pouring nearly half of its state budget into a single war. Entire regions are being reshaped into recruitment hubs and military facilities. And what does this unprecedented spending deliver? Barely noticeable shifts on the battlefield map. From a strategic standpoint, this is not a story of victory. It is a struggle for survival, one paid for by dismantling the country's own long-term future. Economic breakdown. In its attempt to bankroll the most extensive conflict Europe has seen since World War II, Russia is simultaneously laying the groundwork for economic disaster. Defense expenditures in the 2026 budget are expected to reach 7 to 8% of GDP, an extraordinary figure that amounts to roughly 40% of total government spending. These numbers may look abstract on paper, but their real-world consequences are already impossible to ignore. The civilian economy is being hollowed out. Labor, capital, and raw materials are almost entirely redirected towards weapons manufacturing, leaving non-military industries gasping for air. Companies outside the defense sector are increasingly resorting to 4-day work weeks simply to survive. This is not a strategic adjustment, it is a warning sign. While state-backed arms producers receive unlimited financing, private civilian businesses are routinely denied loans. The result has been a growing wave of wage delays, job insecurity, and quiet layoffs in sectors unrelated to the war. Ordinary citizens are feeling the pressure directly. Official statements insist inflation is under control, pointing to a reported rate of 5.6%. But these claims ring hollow as everyday prices continue to climb. The recent increase in value-added tax from 20 to 22% only adds to the burden. Lower inflation on paper doesn't mean cheaper groceries. Instead, higher taxes effectively transfer the cost of the war straight into household budgets. Without fully realizing it, Russian citizens are funding the Kremlin's ambitions at the expense of their own living standards. And history shows that when state propaganda clashes with daily reality, reality tends to win. By 2026, that lesson may become painfully clear. Energy revenue shock. As if domestic pressures weren't enough, Russia's economy is also being hit from the outside. In response to Moscow's military campaign, Ukraine has intensified its countermeasures. Drone strikes deep inside Russian territory, particularly against oil refineries, have struck at the heart of the Kremlin's most reliable source of income. Data from 2025 already reveals a sharp decline. Oil and gas revenues fell by roughly 24% compared to the previous year. This shortfall represents about $30 billion less than projected in the state budget. That missing money has real consequences: fewer funds to pay troops, fuel military equipment, or sustain public services. Ukraine's strategy is not limited to the battlefield. By targeting energy infrastructure, it is attacking Russia's financial lifeline. Refinery damage reduces output, disrupts supply chains, and even raises the risk of fuel shortages within Russia itself. For a country built on energy exports, the irony could hardly be more severe. So what in practical terms has the Russian military gained on the battlefield in exchange for this enormous spending spree that's pushing the economy towards breakdown? This is where the situation becomes both most revealing and most tragic. After an entire year marked by constant infantry assaults, massed frontal attacks, and the destruction of thousands of armored vehicles, Russia has expanded the territory it controls in Ukraine from roughly 18% to about 19.3%. Put plainly, 12 months of fighting, tens of thousands of casualties, and billions of dollars have produced a territorial increase of just 1.3%. Some military analysts have drawn parallels to World War II, but the comparison only highlights how grim today's reality is. Back then, the Red Army was advancing decisively across Eastern Europe. Today, Putin's forces spend months grinding through the ruins of little-known villages. Describing this approach as a success requires a complete detachment from reality. Russia is effectively exchanging its long-term military and state capacity for a handful of devastated square kilometers. Nowhere is this failure more visible than in the collapse of the Kremlin's declared military objectives. The idea that Russia could fully seize the Donbass by April 2026 bears no resemblance to conditions on the ground. The capture of Bakhmut alone required months of fighting. Ahead lie cities such as Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, far more heavily fortified and prepared for defense. Ukraine has been reinforcing this line since 2014. Given Russia's current advance and casualty levels, taking these cities would not take months but years and a staggering human cost. Compounding the problem, Moscow has failed to build half of the 14 new divisions it planned to field by 2026. Those units that do exist are largely composed of poorly trained and inadequately equipped personnel, rather than professional, combat-ready formations. An increase in numbers cannot compensate for a collapse in quality. This reality became especially clear on the Pokrovsk axis in Donetsk region toward the end of 2025. Putin imposed strict deadlines on his commanders to capture this key logistical center. Yet, Pokrovsk remains under Ukrainian control. Russian forces attempted to encircle the city and push into its outskirts, but they were unable to breach Ukraine's adaptable defensive system. More importantly, Ukrainian forces went beyond defense. In the latter half of 2025, localized counterattacks north of Pokrovsk towards Dornit direction reclaimed roughly 430 square kilometers. These maneuvers fractured Russian assault groups and drained their momentum. A human cost that cannot be sustained. This battlefield deadlock is consuming not just territory, but Russia's manpower at an alarming rate. According to figures cited by Ukrainian President Zelensky, Russian losses amount to around 30,000 troops each month. Even if NATO estimates place the number lower, between 20,000 and 25,000, the conclusion is unchanged. In a single month, Russia is losing more soldiers than the Soviet Union lost during entire years of its war in Afghanistan. This arithmetic simply does not work. To offset these losses, the Kremlin has raised enlistment bonuses to nearly $39,000, a sum that can be transformative for many Russian families. Yet, even this has stopped working. The supply of willing volunteers is drying up. As financial incentives lose their power, the Kremlin is left facing a far more dangerous alternative: large-scale mobilization. Such a move would pose a direct threat to domestic political stability. Despite this risk, Russian Security Council Deputy Manager Dmitry Medvedev has announced plans to bring in more than 400,000 additional troops. In reality, this appears less like a solution and more like feeding an unprepared mass of men into an inferno. Rather than reversing the situation, it is likely to accelerate losses and deepen the crisis. Reliance on isolated allies. Russia's predicament in 2026 extends far beyond budget shortfalls or shrinking combat units. An even more damaging reality undermines Moscow's claim to great power status: dependence. What once advertised as the world's second-largest army now survives only through logistical lifelines of internationally isolated states. Rather than acting as a military leader, Russia has slipped into the role of a client. Unable to meet its own ammunition needs, the Kremlin has turned to North Korea for millions of artillery shells. Yet battlefield reports reveal a grim truth. Much of this ammunition is unreliable and dangerous. Poor manufacturing standards, inconsistent propellant loads, and lack of quality control have led to shells malfunctioning, sometimes detonating inside gun barrels and destroying Russian artillery systems themselves. On paper, Russia might still claim artillery superiority, but in practice, that advantage is increasingly illusory. As its strategic reserves shrink, Russia is also becoming technologically captive to partners like North Korea and Iran. The cost of this dependency is not merely financial. Moscow has reportedly been forced to barter sensitive missile and weapons expertise in exchange for supplies. This trade risks spreading advanced military knowledge far beyond Ukraine, unsettling security dynamics in regions such as the Pacific. In effect, Putin is wagering Russia's most guarded military secrets to sustain short-term battlefield pressure. This ambitious gamble does not show Moscow's statting strength. It is the sign of desperation.
On another, less visible front, electronic warfare, Russia's position has also deteriorated. Early in the war, Moscow enjoyed a decisive edge in signal disruption and GPS jamming. By 2026, that advantage has eroded. Ukrainian forces now deploy AI-enabled autonomous drones that operate without continuous operator control. These systems visually identify targets and execute missions independently, making traditional jamming techniques largely ineffective. As a result, Russia's costly electronic warfare platforms, once a cornerstone of its military doctrine, are being rendered obsolete. The Kremlin is attempting to fight a software-driven conflict using hardware-centric thinking. This inability to adapt has become a direct contributor to rising casualties at the front. Russia is no longer facing only military resistance, but a widening technological and intellectual gap. Ukraine's approach in 2026. While Russia struggles with manpower shortages and outdated doctrine, Ukraine has recalibrated its strategy for 2026 around active defense paired with targeted attrition. As Ukrainian Chief of the General Staff Alexander Syrskyi has emphasized, holding ground is essential, but it alone does not secure victory. This approach reflects hard lessons learned from the much-anticipated 2023 counteroffensive. At that time, Ukrainian units were dispersed across an overly broad front, and mechanized formations suffered heavy losses against entrenched Russian defenses and extensive minefields. The current picture is different. Ukraine is nearing completion of deep structural reforms within its armed forces. Previously ad hoc battalion formations have been reorganized under permanent professional command structures. This shift has streamlined decision-making, shortened command chains, and improved logistical coordination. Compared to Russia's rigid and centralized system, Ukraine's forces now operate with far greater flexibility and speed. Syrskyi's strategic logic is straightforward. While Russia burns through manpower to gain marginal ground, Ukraine will strike selectively, disrupting supply lines, eroding morale, and inflicting losses where they matter most. Precision, not mass, defines Ukraine's battlefield calculus for 2026. Energy as a weapon. Failing to secure decisive gains on the battlefield, Moscow has increasingly turned to a dangerous alternative: energy weaponizing. The war is being pushed directly into Ukrainian homes, not through tanks, but through cold apartments and darkened cities. Russian missile strikes are systematically aimed at transformer stations linked to Ukraine's nuclear power facilities. These are not tactical military targets. The objective is to cripple daily life, trigger a humanitarian emergency, and pressure Kiev into concessions. President Zelensky has described this campaign as energy blackmail. Yet, instead of breaking Ukraine's resolve, the strategy has hardened public resistance and strengthened the case for expanded Western air defense assistance. In exchange for temporary disruption, Moscow is adding new pages to its record of long-term war crimes, a trade-off that generates chaos today but consequences for decades. A moment of reckoning. Viewed as a whole, 2026 looks less like a year of triumph for Russia and more like a moment of reckoning. Energy revenues are shrinking. Recruiting soldiers is becoming increasingly difficult. The civilian economy is buckling under the weight of war. And on the front lines, Ukraine is fighting with greater cohesion, adaptability, and strategic clarity than at any previous stage of the conflict. Russia's military apparatus is vast, destructive, and dangerous, but it's corroding from within. Its mechanisms are wearing down, its resources are being drained, and its momentum is fading. Ukraine's resistance is not only holding territory, it's steadily exhausting the Russian state's ability to sustain the war. Moscow finds itself trapped in a conflict it cannot decisively win, yet cannot afford to abandon. Putin's strategy has rested on a single gamble, that Ukraine and its Western supporters would eventually grow weary. But the evidence suggests otherwise. The fatigue appears to be setting in on the Russian side, in its economy, its military, and its future. If there is a year when this unsustainable balance finally collapses, 2026 may well be it. Whatever narratives are being crafted inside the Kremlin, the arithmetic on the battlefield tells a far less forgiving story. The question of survival. This ongoing structural decay raises a deeper and more unsettling question. Even if the fighting were to stop tomorrow, would the Russian state still be capable of functioning as a stable, modern system? The issue is no longer how much land Russia might seize in Ukraine, but whether the Russian Federation itself can emerge intact from a war pursued for a hollow symbolic victory. For Putin, the war has become existential. For Russia as a state, it is increasingly beginning to resemble a slow unraveling. History offers a clear lesson. Empires rarely fall because of enemies at the gates. They collapse when internal fractures grow too wide to contain. In 2026, those fractures are becoming impossible to ignore. So, how long can the Kremlin continue to suppress the growing strain beneath the surface? How long will Russian society bear the cost? And will history once again follow a familiar path? We invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Until our next deep dive analysis, take care.